Four parties are going to front candidates for president. Die-hard former Whigs and know-nothings who felt that they could not support the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party formed and nominated John C. Bell of Tennessee for president. John C. Bell's Constitutional Union Party, their platform essentially advocated compromise to save the Union. These are the former know-nothings, with a slogan of, quote, the Union as it is and the Constitution as it is, end of quote. Their platform is essentially to maintain the status quo. They're going to be a minor party. The Democratic Party is now split into two factions that each will nominate different presidents, different presidential candidates, Southern and Northern Democrats. The Southern Democrats nominate pro-slavery incumbent Vice President John Cabell Breckinridge of Kentucky. Their platform of the Southern Democratic Party is that, one, the government of a territory organized by an act of Congress is provisional and temporary, and during its existence, all citizens of the United States have an equal right to settle with their property in the territory without their rights either of person or property being destroyed or impaired by congressional or territorial legislation. Obviously, property refers to slaves. Two, that it is the duty of the federal government in all its departments to protect, when necessary, the rights of persons and their property in the territories. Whatever else is constitutional authority and wherever else its constitutional authority extends. Three, that when the settlers in a territory having an adequate population form a state constitution, the right of sovereignty commences, and being consummated by admission into the Union, they stand on equal footing with the people of other states, and the state thus organized ought to be admitted into the federal Union, whether its constitution prohibits or recognizes the institution of slavery. That's a kind of now more definitive description of the popular sovereignty thesis, and so the doctrine of popular sovereignty essentially, as the Southern Democrats are going to define it, means that the people, the settlers, will choose before they become a state in the territorial stage whether they will adopt a slave constitution or a free labor constitution, and whichever they choose, they are to be admitted into the federal union with one or the other as they have chosen. Popular sovereignty. So those 3 points are the points of the Southern Democrats. The Northern Democrats nominate Senator Stephen Douglas as their presidential candidate, and essentially they endorse the same Southern Democratic platform, only adding to it one more clause, a promise to abide by the decisions of the United States Supreme Court. And so this leaves now the Republican Party and their convention of 1860. 4 candidates, all lawyers, are going to seek the Republican Party nomination in 1860. Edward Bates is the eldest of the four. Born in Virginia in 1793, his father had been a wealthy planter who had counted Thomas Jefferson and James Madison as his friends. When the family comes upon hard times after the Revolutionary War, and when Bates was 11, his father died and the family was broken apart. Edward was fortunate to be educated by a scholarly cousin in Maryland. After serving in the War of 1812, Bates settles in Missouri in 1814 at the age of 21 and apprentices in law. It's a fortunate choice because President Jefferson had appointed Bates's older brother as secretary for the Missouri Territory. Bates is a delegate to the Missouri Constitutional Convention. He's a former state senator and one-term Whig congressman from 1827 to 1829. And eventually he'll lose a Missouri state race and will settle in St. Louis as a judge on the St. Louis Land Court. In 1840, he becomes a prominent Whig, and when the Whig Party falls apart in the 1850s, Bates joins the Republicans. He's not actively seeking a nomination, but the Republican Party offers him an opportunity because Bates is essentially, as I say, isolated in St. Louis. He is not tainted the way the other candidates will be tainted with their very prominent roles in both the Whig Party and then the founding of the Republican Party. Bates has been married for 14 years, and he had 17 children. I think I said 14 years. He was married for 40 years, and he had 17 children, although not all of them survived. And so Bates was not particularly anxious to campaign, and basically he stayed at home in St. Louis, was not an active participant. Much more active is going to be William Seward, one of the founders of the Republican Party. Seward, of course, is a monumental figure in American politics. He will be the Secretary of State under Lincoln, and he's the guy who buys Alaska for the United States in 1867 after the Civil War. Seward is born in 1801 in Florida, New York, a small town in New York, about 80 kilometers north of New York City. He's the son of a wealthy physician who as well becomes a judge. Seward attends Union College in upstate New York, graduates in 1820 with high honors. He now apprentices with a prominent attorney in New York City, and once he passes his bar exam, he joins Judge Elijah Miller's law firm in Auburn, New York. And Auburn is the site of the first federal penitentiary. So that will become essentially Seward's constituency, where he'll become a very successful attorney. He will marry his boss's daughter, and he'll move into the Miller's family palatial home, which eventually it will become his home. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the house that's the Seward Museum today in Auburn, New York. William Seward first enters politics in 1829 as a candidate for the anti-Masonic Party. This is a party that has a brief life in the late 1820s or early 1830s, as Americans suddenly become concerned that there's kind of this Masonic secret society conspiracy in the United States, affecting politics as much as we're concerned here in Canada as well, with both the Masonic Party and the Orange Order. And so he is elected as a New York State Senator from 1830 to 1834 on the anti-Masonic Party ticket. But the anti-Masonic Party eventually begins to fade away, and it's fused into the newly emerging Whig Party in 1836. And Seward now will go into the Whig Party. From 1838 to 1842, Seward is elected as governor of New York for 2 terms on the Whig Party ticket. Seward is a reformer. He's, as state senator and governor, he promotes progressive political policies, including prison reform, as well as increased spending on education, including the idea that immigrants should be taught in their own language and by members of their own religion in the public school system. So a very progressive idea, for the 19th century, even today. That would be thought crazy. Nonetheless, that was Seward's position. When Seward is elected to the United States Senate as a Whig in 1848, he emerges as the leader of the anti-slavery wing of the Whig Party. In other words, he's the leader of the conscience Whigs. Seward is an opponent of the Fugitive Slave Act. He defended runaway slaves in court pro bono. Seward believed that there was a, quote, higher law than the Constitution, claiming that slavery was morally wrong. And he used this as a justification in defending runaways and his support of personal liberty laws in those debates. Remember Prigg versus Pennsylvania, the significance of personal liberty laws. In September of 1848, while campaigning for the Whig presidential candidate Zachary Taylor in Massachusetts, Seward and Lincoln now end up sharing a bed for a night in a hotel. Again, according to Doris Goodwin, they talk long into the night, with Seward criticizing Lincoln for his kind of very lukewarm anti-slavery stance. Seward will recall, quote, "We spent the greater part of the night talking, I insisting that the time had come for sharp definition of opinion and boldness of attitude," end of quote. Doris Goodwin will write, quote, "As the conversation drew to a close and the 2 men went to sleep side by side, they must have presented a comical image. The one nearly half a foot longer and a decade younger, Seward's disorderly mass of straw-colored hair on the pillow beside Lincoln's wiry shock of black hair," end of quote. So perhaps inspired by his one-night stand with Seward, Lincoln returns for the remainder of his term in Congress, and he drafts a bill for the gradual emancipation of slaves in Washington, D.C. with voter approval. But in the end, he realizes that he could not get support for it, and so he withdraws the bill. Seward will vote against the Compromise of 1850. He claims in 1850 in a speech that if slavery is not abolished, America will become embroiled in a civil war. And he'll continue arguing this point of view over the next 10 years. He presents himself as the leading enemy of slave power. That is, a perceived conspiracy of Southern slave owners to seize the government and defeat the progress of liberty. With the disintegration of the Whig Party in 1850, Seward now joins the Republican Party in 1855, and he's reelected as senator from New York. In fact, he not only joins the Republican Party, but he is one of the three primary founding fathers of the Republican Party, along with Salmon P. Chase and Horace Greeley, a publisher, not a politician. By 1855, once Seward is reelected as senator for New York, by then he begins moderating his views, and he becomes more of a gradualist on the issue of the emancipation of slaves rather than an immediatist. He begins to distance himself from the kind of anti-slave abolitionist left wing of the Republican Party, who become known as the Radical Republicans. And the Radical Republicans are going to give a lot of grief to Lincoln throughout his presidency. In 1856, during that presidential election in which Buchanan is going to be elected, Seward will seek the Republican nomination for the presidency, but he's going to lose out to John C. Fremont. Seward, as one, as I say, of the founding members of the Republican Party, feels that he is due the presidential nomination, that he should be now president of the United States, or at least should lead the Republican Party into the 1860 presidential election. So in 1860, he now believes his time has come. And he's so convinced of this that Seward hardly campaigns for the nomination. He thinks and is almost assured that it's a done deal. In fact, his campaign team will send Seward overseas on a tour to Europe and Egypt to keep him away from the press, so that he doesn't say something wrong and jinx his nomination. Seward is actually kept away from publicity until the scheduled convention. The third candidate is Salmon Portland Chase, also one of the founders of the Republican Party and the former founder of the Free Soil Party. It's Salmon P. Chase that brings many of his fellow Free Soil Party members to the Republican Party. Salmon Chase also feels that he's due the nomination. Salmon Chase, his name Salmon, like the fish. He himself will make comments that he has a fishy sounding name. For the life of me, I don't know how he ended up with the name Salmon, but that's it. Salmon Portland Chase was his name. Born January 1808. He's only a year older than Lincoln, but their backgrounds could not be more different. Chase is born in Cornish, New Hampshire. He too loses his father when he's 9 years old. He'll be raised by his austere uncle, Philander Chase, an Episcopalian bishop. He studies in private schools that his uncle headed in Windsor, Vermont, then in Worthington, Ohio, then Cincinnati College and Royalton Academy, Vermont. And then once he graduates school, he enters Dartmouth College, where he graduates in 1826. He settles in New York City, where he establishes a successful boys' school for the children of the city's elite, but he's bored by the whole enterprise of running a school. He meets the father of two of his pupils, who happens to be U.S. Attorney General William Wirt. And he's accepted by him as an apprentice in Wirt's legal practice, and he will be admitted to the bar in 1829, 1 year short, actually, of the required 3-year apprenticeship. He's so smart as a apprentice lawyer. In 1830, Chase now moves to Cincinnati, Ohio, which becomes his constituency. And by 1836, he is associating himself with the anti-slavery movement. He defends escaped slaves seized in Ohio, again, pro bono. He is dubbed, in fact, the, quote, Attorney General for fugitive slaves, end of quote. He'll be elected as a Whig to the Cincinnati City Council in 1840. He then abandons the next year that party, and for 7 years is the undisputed leader of the Liberty Party in Ohio. Eventually, he, as I say, is after 1848, he will combine his Liberty Party with the barn burner anti-slave Democrats, or sometimes they're called the Van Buren Democrats, to form the Free Soiler Party. 1849, Chase is elected to the United States Senate from Ohio on the Free Soil Party ticket, and in 1855, he's elected governor of Ohio. During his service in the Senate from 1849 to 1855, Chase is preeminently the champion of anti-slavery in the Senate. He is probably can be considered, once he joins the Republican Party, as a radical Republican and the leader of the radical factions of the Republic. He condemns the compromise measures of 1850, and he condemns the Kansas-Nebraska Bill of 1854. And 1854, he now assumes the leadership in the Northwest of the movement to form a new party and to oppose the extension of slavery, and that's the Republican Party. He's going to be the first Republican governor of Ohio. He will serve from 1855 till 1859. Chase had been married 3 times, and each time his wife died. He never married a 4th time. He lived with his 2 surviving daughters, and in fact, one of his daughters becomes an organizer, his campaign manager, an organizer in Ohio of the Republican Party machine, and so one of the first female organizers, party campaign managers, working behind a candidate. So certainly, again, a progressive thing for the 1850s. 1860, Salmon P. Chase thinks that he too is due to be nominated as president of the Republican Party, and he wants, of course, the Republican Party to be a little bit more radical than certainly the position that Seward is taking, kind of a more now middle of the road position. So Salmon P. Chase, just like Seward, is convinced that he's going to get the nomination. And Salmon P. Chase hardly, campaigns. So that's the three candidates, and it leaves us the fourth candidate, a dark horse, likely to come in last. Everybody thinks he's going to come in last. This is also a lawyer, a promising, passionate, and articulate attorney and politician, but not seasoned with much experience in government, unlike the other candidates, and certainly lacking the refined and formally educated background that the other candidates have, and maybe perhaps just physically too much a weird, lanky looking country hick to be elected as president of the United States. And of course, we're talking about Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln indeed is the fourth candidate, but it's a last-minute candidacy. Nobody thinks that Lincoln is going to be elected. On the other hand, all that lack of experience for Lincoln also means lacking baggage and lacking enemies. William Seward is clearly the front runner, but he has a radical reputation that troubles some of the delegates at the Republican Party convention. And the Republican Party convention will be held that May in 1860 in Chicago. Seward, for example, had been blamed for the fanaticism of John Brown at Harper's Ferry, not only by enemies in the South, but as well as enemies in the North. And remember, of course, just a year earlier, Seward had declared in a speech that, quote, an irrepressible conflict now was dividing the Union between freedom and slave power. In the months before the convention was scheduled for May of 1860, Seward attempted to ratchet down the conflict between the free states and the slave states. And he begins to change his language as well. He starts referring to the slave states, not as slave states, but as, quote, capital states, capital in the accounting terms, when, machinery in your business is considered as a, quote, capital investment. And so slaves are just seen as capital property. And so he describes slave states as capital states, while free states he describes as labor states. It doesn't help much. Seward has, of course, alienated some major figures in his own party, including, as we'll see, Horace Greeley, the third founder of the Republican Party and the publisher of what is the Republican Party's official newspaper, the New York Tribune. The Seward team is so confident of victory that they never even bother to secure the pledges from the delegations arriving for the convention. And they don't even realize that they've actually alienated some of the Republican delegates. And as I say, making matters worse, Seward's advisors got Seward out of the limelight into the United States to take this trip abroad in Europe and the Middle East. So Seward is mostly absent for the 8 months before that convention. And Salmon P. Chase, likewise, is so confident of victory that He does not bother appointing a campaign manager, or again, neither does Salmon P. Chase neither does he go out to secure pledges from distant state delegations. He turns down invitations to speak at meetings, preferring to stay at home. He was convinced only in the last few months of the lead up to the convention to visit Washington and make the necessary rounds. And Bates, as I said, he just is sitting back and really doesn't care whether he gets the nomination. He accepted it as a favor to the Republican Party. Lincoln, on the other hand, hits the campaign road, visiting state after state, village after village, vigorously campaigning party delegates who would soon be coming to the convention. Lincoln takes any opportunity to speak, whether it's a church basement or a theater or a restaurant or bar, but Lincoln just goes on the campaign trail, making multiple speeches a day, traveling through the United States by train, making speeches off the back of the train. He just campaigns in a way that the other three delegates do not. Lincoln's campaign team also, realizing that Lincoln is a dark horse, unknown candidate, the polls in the rudimentary form that they existed back then show essentially Lincoln coming in last from the four candidates. Nobody knows who Lincoln is, and so his campaign team now gently but firmly, without ever making disparaging remarks about other candidates, begin to press Lincoln on the delegates as their possible second choice should something maybe go awry or they change their mind with their first choice candidate. And so Lincoln ends up campaigning so vigorously as a second choice candidate that in fact he actually will become a second choice candidate by the time the convention starts. 233 votes were needed to secure the nomination. One thing is going to go wrong for Seward. Seward, in the time he was governor of New York, made an error in offending Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley, as I say, the publisher of the New York Tribune, was seeking some kind of appointment in the New York State government as well, and somehow Seward had overlooked him. And unknown to Seward, Horace Greeley now badmouths Seward during the convention in May, and he alienates a number of Republican candidates from Seward. And indeed, when they begin to think, well, if I'm not going to vote for Seward, here's all these people pushing this guy Abraham Lincoln as maybe my second choice. Who is this Lincoln? And they look at Lincoln, and so 233 votes are needed to secure the nomination. When the first ballot is counted, Seward gets 173.5 votes, Lincoln 102 second, and Chase 49, Bates 48. And so on the very first ballot, Lincoln, to the shock of everyone, had become a second choice alternative to Seward, while Chase and Bates now fall behind. On the second ballot, Lincoln now picks up more votes. It was now 181 to Seward's 183 and a half, while Chase and Bates now lose further ground. Essentially, they're taken out of the race. On the third ballot, Lincoln now reaches a total of 231 and a half votes, 1/2 vote short of being nominated as the presidential candidate of the Republican Party. And 10 seconds after that voting result is announced, the Ohio delegation, Salmon Chase's home state delegation, now switches their 4 votes from Chase to Lincoln. And that's how Abraham Lincoln is nominated as the Republican candidate for the president. None of the candidates were in Chicago at the time of the convention. They were waiting for the results in their hometowns. And in those days, candidates for a nomination did not actually attend the convention the way they do today. They did not make speeches there. It was done by their representatives and the various delegates at the convention. And as well, once a presidential candidate is nominated, they almost don't campaign after that. It's almost as if it's over, and then you have the election in November, and people will vote one way or the other. Although I'm sure they campaigned in other ways than people campaign today. Seward is angry. He's hurt. He's humiliated. But he keeps all this to himself, cloaking it in good politician's grace. Salmon P. Chase just can't hide his fury that the fact that his Ohio delegation failed to unanimously support him. He feels betrayed by his own Ohioans. Chase will say, quote, "When I remember what New York did for Seward, what Illinois did for Lincoln, and what Missouri did for Bates, and remember also that neither of these gentlemen ever spent a fourth part, if indeed a tithe, of time, labor, and means for the Republican Party in their respective states that I have spent for the party in Ohio, and then reflect on the action of the Ohio delegation in Chicago toward me, I confess I have little heart to write or think about it." End of quote. As for Bates, of course, he didn't want to run in the first place. His message was, quote, "I had no claim, literally none, upon the Republicans as a party, and no right to expect their party honors, and I shall cherish with enduring gratitude the recollection of the generous confidence with which many of their very best men have honored me." Very nice kind of political statement. I don't care anyway. Thanks, but no thanks. Generations of historians have been trying to explain Lincoln's surprising victory at the Republican convention in Chicago. As one historian writes, quote, "The fact of the convention was the defeat of Seward rather than the nomination of Lincoln." End of quote. Seward had too much baggage, and he himself would later explain, quote, "The leader of a political party in a country like ours is so exposed that his enemies become as numerous and formidable as his friends." End of quote. According to Seward, Lincoln, by contrast, was, quote, comparatively unknown, had not to contend with the animosities generally marshaled against a leader, end of quote. And in fact, Seward will consider himself, as we'll see, as the leader of the Republican Party, not the president of the United States. And in fact, Seward will often see himself as kind of a prime minister to Lincoln's presidency. And he'll tell that to ambassadors, in fact, that Lincoln is kind of like a constitutional king and that the real person in charge is the prime minister himself, Seward. So there is some truth in all this, but that Lincoln was inexperienced and had no enemies, but it doesn't explain why Lincoln is the beneficiary of Seward's downfall. Why not Chase? Why not Bates? Some historians argue it's pure luck that the convention was held in Chicago, Lincoln's home state, where the strength of his local support took him over the top. Others argue that Lincoln was perfectly positioned in the center of the Republican Party. He was less radical than Chase and less radical than Seward's reputation, but less conservative than Bates. And so he's less offensive to everybody all around on both sides than Bates or Seward and Chase. Others credit Lincoln's campaign team with positioning him in second place from the beginning, a brilliant strategy, predicated on a gamble that opposition to the first place candidate would coalesce around Lincoln. Lincoln himself, less privileged than other candidates, was accustomed to relying on himself to shape events, while Seward spent 18 months abroad. Salmon P. Chase did not even have a campaign manager. Lincoln strenuously toured the Midwestern states, drumming up support. Those public meetings that Seward and Salmon P. Chase turned down invitations for were all attended by Lincoln. And listening to Lincoln speak, Seward's supporters knew that if their first choice could not win, they had in Lincoln at least an eloquent orator whom they could trust, who could hold fast on the central issue that forged the party, the fight against extending slavery into the territories. Even though Lincoln himself had entered the anti-slavery faction much later than Seward or Chase, his speeches nonetheless possessed a kind of power, conviction, clarity, and moral strength that could not be ignored. And Lincoln's nickname, of course, is Honest Abe. He would say it as it is, and very few politicians, when asked, what's their policy position, could say, well, take a look at what my policy position was 20 years ago. It's the same today as it was back then. That's a rare thing to hear a politician say. And so Lincoln, who throughout his career had actually been cautious and precise in the months prior to the election, as the other three candidates had either alienated one faction or the other, found themselves backpedaling from their previous positions, Lincoln remained true and steady. In the end, of course, nothing can sometimes explain the serendipity of historical greatness. And Lincoln, like many great figures of history, does take charge of the moment. And maybe it's, kind of a chicken or eggs situation. Does Lincoln really become this great figure in history after his assassination, or was it that he already was this great figure and took history in hand by, again, virtue of serendipity? But it's difficult to imagine the course of the conflict to come had someone else been president, had Seward, as able as he was a governor, had Seward become president, would the Civil War and the impact it had on the United States to this day taken on the shape that it did without Lincoln? It's hard to say, but certainly Lincoln's greatness, in a way, is reflected in his choice of cabinet officers once he is elected president. He will choose his rivals. William Seward will become Secretary of State, very much the way Obama chose his strongest rival for the nomination, Hillary Clinton, to become his Secretary of State. So Lincoln chooses William Seward as his Secretary of State, the most important position in a presidential cabinet, often seen as kind of a senior position. Salmon P. Chase will become Lincoln's U.S. Treasury Secretary and will do a splendid job as Treasury Secretary in raising the financing for the war. And Edward Bates will become the Attorney General. And thus, again, the title of Doris Goodwin's book, The Team of Rivals. And they will remain rivals. I mean, we'll see in further lectures, how Seward is in the beginning trying to essentially lead the presidency, he feels that Lincoln is a dummy. Chase, we'll see, will be conspiring behind Lincoln's back throughout his presidency, to the point that Lincoln will describe, quote, fire in the rear, coming from Salmon P. Chase and his supporters, especially as the next presidential election in 1864 is dawning. We'll see that Salmon P. Chase is going to attempt to win the next nomination over Lincoln. Once Lincoln is nominated, of course, Lincoln does not campaign, as I said. His position, he makes very clear. The Republican Party was against further expansion of slavery, but it was committed to not interfering with slavery where it already existed. And William Seward now will campaign loyally for Lincoln and the Republicans in his home state of New York, and he'll garner important swing votes for Lincoln in New York. But the election of Lincoln in the South is going to prove to be the final straw that breaks the camel's back for Southern state rights and secessionist militants. Often the message of the Republican Party and Lincoln's position is distorted in the Southern states and presented as a commitment to the emancipation of all slaves. Southerners are complaining that the North is not enforcing the slave fugitive law and, quote, tyrannically preparing to take away their property rights and their slaves. And John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry further radicalizes many Southern state right militants and pro-slavers. And warnings begin to come from the South that should Lincoln be elected as president of the United States, Southern states will secede from the Union. Few in the North are taking these warnings seriously. They have been hearing these threats since the 1820s, since John C. Calhoun attempted to introduce the nullification doctrine. And so the South had threatened to secede, to get their way so many times that nobody really at this point in 1860 is taking the South seriously. In November, Americans vote and they elect Lincoln as president with 40% of the popular vote. It's clearly that the voting is divided between South and North. You can see Lincoln takes California, Oregon. He takes the northern states, including his own state of Illinois. The Northern Democratic Party, their candidate, Stephen Douglas, takes only one state. Southern Democrats of course take the southern states, while the Constitution Union will take kind of the upper southern states, the border states. Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, all become part of the election. As I look at this map, it's the first time I noticed it, that New Jersey seems to be divided in half, and I think that's just a color insertion error. So it looks like New Jersey will be Douglas's state, as will Missouri be. So in terms of the popular vote, despite the fact it's only two states, Douglas does take 29% of the popular vote. The Southern Democrats will take 18%. The Constitutional Union gets 13%, and Lincoln gets this miserable 40%. He certainly sweeps the electoral vote by 59%, but only 40% of the popular vote. Kind of in the way Trump took the electoral vote, but he was short by, I think, 2 million votes behind Hillary Clinton. She actually had the majority of the popular vote in the way Trump did not. He was, if I'm not mistaken, 2 million short. Lincoln, in those days, would not take office until March of 1861. It's only when Roosevelt is elected in the 1932 elections that Americans are so desperate that a new president take charge of the White House that they move the inauguration from March all the way back into January, so that FDR can essentially start saving the country in the way many people saw it, kind of in the way people are dreading what will happen in the 2 months everybody's going to wait. If, say, Trump loses the election, he remains president until January with presidential powers to do whatever further damage he can do. That was the situation with the election of FDR, and they changed essentially the inauguration date. They moved it back from March to January then. But for now, Buchanan remains president. and everything that's going to happen now will often be blamed on Buchanan. That's why he earns the last, as that vote by historians as the worst president in American history. Although, as I say, it was taken in the 1960s. The speed with which southern states now begin seceding from the Union is a shock to Americans. South Carolina will go first. By Christmas, South Carolina politicians in Washington had abandoned their homes and packed their furniture and left. And December 20, South Carolina legislators now vote to dissolve the Union between South Carolina and the United States by a vote of 169-0. And so South Carolina secedes. Charleston certainly will become known as the cradle of the secession. And there's a bell in Charleston, Carolina that will ring every time a southern state secedes, and the bell will become known as Secession. It will be given a name. January 9th, Mississippi now secedes. The next day, January 10th, Florida leaves the Union. Alabama leaves on the 11th. Georgia leaves January 19th. Louisiana will leave January 26th, and Texas will now leave February 1st. There's a somber tone in Washington that Christmas as those South Carolina congressmen empty their desks and move out of their homes in Washington. Lincoln is urged to moderate his position prior to the inauguration. He refuses, explaining that any backtracking on his position that he intends to restrict the further spread of slavery, but has no intention of interfering with slavery where it's practiced. He says it's too late for backtracking now. And in fact, it would only intensify the demands and strength of the South. Lincoln is willing to compromise on the Fugitive Slave Act. He's willing to compromise on the question of slavery in Washington, D.C. itself, on any slave issue where slavery still existed. But he will not back down on the Republican Party position that slavery is not to be further expanded. Kentucky Senator John J. Crittenden attempts to work out a last-minute compromise through a peace convention in late February before Congress adjourns. In it, in what becomes known as the Crittenden Compromise, it's proposed that the Missouri Compromise line of 36 degrees 30 be now reinstated, but extended all the way to the Pacific. But he can't get now any majority support from any party in Congress. And so it's becoming too late for compromise. Southern states, in the meantime, as Lincoln sits helplessly in Springfield waiting for his term of office to begin in March, southern states are, in the meantime, seizing control of federal facilities, post offices, harbors, arsenals, armories, and forts. 2 forts occupied by Union troops will hold out: Fort Pickens in Florida and Fort Sumter at Charleston, South Carolina. And those two forts will become the focus of the first major will become the first of the first major exchanges of fire, not battles, but exchanges of fire between what is going to become the Confederate Army and the Union Army. The seceding states will now form a new country, the CSA, the Confederate States of America, and they'll elect Jefferson Davis as their president. Jefferson Davis was actually the Secretary of War during the 1850s for the United States. The Confederate States of America have a constitution that is almost exactly the same as the U.S. Constitution, including a ban on the international slave trade. But the CSA Constitution recognizes the right of property in the form of slaves. The other difference is that the president of the CSA sits a term of 6 years instead of the 4 in the USA, and as well, when approving a budget sent up by Congress, the CSA president has a line veto on terms in the budget. Under the U.S. Constitution, the president either rejects the entire budget or signs off on it. Under the CSA Constitution, the president can strike out certain parts of the budget. But other than that, the two constitutions are almost exactly the same. Lincoln, in the meantime, had remained in Springfield, Illinois, until February 11th, when he begins this kind of slow, circular 12-day trip to Washington, stopping off at all these places along the way to thank his followers. In the last day of the trip, while he stopped at Philadelphia, Lincoln is told that there's an assassination plot against him at his last scheduled stop in Baltimore, Maryland. Maryland, which is north of Washington, D.C., is very pro-secession and pro-slavery and pro-Confederacy. And so Lincoln is urged to secretly take a night train direct to Washington without stopping off in Baltimore. Lincoln at first refuses. He says, "You won't just sneak into Washington as a thief." He makes this one last appearance in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but he is persuaded now by his security, which at this point is Pinkerton Security Company, Pinkerton Private Investigators. He's persuaded that he shouldn't make this stop in Maryland. And so all the other trains along the route are sidetracked. Telegraph wires between Harrisburg, Baltimore, and Washington are temporarily cut until they can get Lincoln into Washington at around 6 a.m. Legend kind of has it that Lincoln was in disguise, wearing this Scottish cap and long cloak, This cartoon kind of laughs at that notion. How are you going to disguise Lincoln, who is so bizarrely tall compared to all the other, the average American? Critics, as I say, complain that Lincoln, quote, crept into the Capitol. It's actually completely untrue. He was not disguised in a Scottish plaid cap. William Seward, by now, has accepted the senior post in Lincoln's future cabinet, that of Secretary of State. But he, as I say, is making plans to control the cabinet and act as a sort of premier to Lincoln's presidency. Seward always felt that he's entitled to and is owed this post for his contributions to the Whig and Republican parties. He does not like Lincoln's plan to create a kind of fusion cabinet of former Whigs, former Free Soilers, and anti-slavery Democrats. Seward feels that the cabinet should be dominated by the kind of anti-slavery Whigs, radical Republicans, middle of the road Republicans, the founding fathers of the Republican family. While Lincoln is still in Springfield, Seward now invites Lincoln to come to his home in Auburn to confer on the makeup of the cabinet. Lincoln very politely declines. He says, well, I'm a little bit busy here in Springfield. I can't really get out to Auburn in New York. Seward then telegraphs back, suggesting that perhaps they can meet halfway in some neutral place between Auburn and Springfield, and Lincoln again politely declines. At which point Seward now says, kind of, okay, I'll come out to Springfield to help you. And at which point Lincoln now says, thanks, but no thanks. I'm already, taking care of it here in Springfield entirely on my own discretion. So Seward is waiting for Lincoln in Washington that morning of his arrival in February. And Seward immediately, he's, like I said, at the train station platform, he immediately goes to work on making himself indispensable to Lincoln and in his attempts to take control as much as he can of cabinet business. Seward escorts Lincoln to the White House to meet the outgoing president, Buchanan. And then Seward accompanies Lincoln to see General Winfield Scott, the commander of the United States Army, which at this point consists of a mere 16,000 to 17,000 men, mostly deployed in the West. Scott, by now, is old and fat. He is the longest serving general in United States military history. He can barely walk. He actually has to be lifted up onto his horse. He can't climb onto his horse anymore. And Scott gives Lincoln very, very bad news and pessimistic news. He immediately, first of all, tells Lincoln that with 17,000 men, he's in no position to fight a 100,000 militia, 100,000 strong Confederate militia that's now becoming the Confederate States Army, the CSA Army, the Confederate Army, that the United States, there's nothing they can physically do with the Federal Army. And moreover, he paints a very gloomy picture of the situation at Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens. He says that Fort Sumter cannot hold out much longer than another 6 weeks at best. And to resupply Fort Sumter, Scott argues he needs at least 25,000 men. And as I say, the U.S. Army and 6 months. And the U.S. Army currently is only, as I say, 17,000 men at most. And so this as well is gloomy news for Lincoln. And Lincoln now is faced, of course, with making his March 4th inaugural address, the first significant public statement since the election. And there's a lot of pressure on Lincoln again to moderate his inaugural address. And as Lincoln meets now with his cabinet, Seward in particular is pressuring Lincoln to moderate his position. And Lincoln, in fact, will do this. Fort Sumter and Fort Pickens are issues because they're federal forts that Confederate states now want to take control of, but there are federal troops in those forts holding off. And Lincoln, in his original inaugural speech, wanted to pledge, quote, that all power at my disposal will be used to reclaim the public property and places which have fallen, to hold, occupy, and possess these and all other property and places belonging to the government. And this was seen as a challenge to the new Confederate states. And Seward, reminds Lincoln that, quote, in any conflict which may ensue between the government and the seceding states, it is very important that the traitors shall be the aggressor, and that they constantly and palpably be in the wrong. And so Lincoln is now urged to cut out the line about, quote, reclaiming property. And so he agrees, leaving in only that the Union would, quote, hold, occupy, and possess those properties they currently hold. And that, of course, is pointed at Fort Pickens and Fort Pickens off the coast of Florida, off Pensacola, Florida, and Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Seward as well notices that Lincoln refers to the Confederate state activities, the secession, as treasonable. Seward again suggests a more inoffensive, more moderate term, revolutionary. And that's, Lincoln goes that way. He replaces the term treasonable with revolutionary. Seward is arguing that, it's not too late to bring in the Southern states, to bring them back into the United States, to reconstruct the United States again. And the night before the inauguration, Congress again attempts to even introduce a proposed constitutional amendment, quote, to the effect that the federal government shall never interfere with the domestic institutions of the states, end of quote. Lincoln had always been against amending the Constitution that way, but now he at least inserts into his speech that he would not object to such an amendment if Congress proceeds to adopt it. And then he repeats his pledge again. I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. And so the United States will go into the Civil War with Lincoln's position being that it is not the objective of the Union to abolish slavery where it already exists. It's not a war that begins to be a war about emancipating the slaves. It's a war about reunifying the United States. It will only become, under the circumstances that I'll describe to you when that lecture comes, a war to free the slaves when it needs to become that for military purposes, for strategic purposes. It's not the moral intent of the Civil War, the way the Union is going to wage it. And so Seward convinces Lincoln to soften the ending of his inaugural speech as well. Originally, Lincoln had thrown out a challenge to the South, saying, "With you and not with me is the solemn question of, shall it be peace or a sword?" When Lincoln delivers his inaugural address, he concludes it on a less challenging tone, and it's more conciliatory, and it's again one of the famous American speeches. And I'll read the salient passage from Lincoln's inaugural address that is often quoted. Quote, "In your hand, my dissatisfied countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not become enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bounds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." End of quote. The better angels of our nature will become one of these seminal speeches in American history, and that address, the inaugural address, is made 5 weeks before the Civil War will break out.